And welcome to Tell Me Your Story, New Paradigms for a New World. I'm Richard Dugan, your host, and I thank you for joining us here on this program as we dive into a wonderful guest that we're going to have here who's going to share with us quite a remarkable story that I think you're really going to enjoy, and you're going to want to go to his website as well. We also encourage you to join us here on this program 4 times a week now, 4 times. Sundays at 7 a.m. and 7 p.m., Monday mornings at 1 a.m., streaming live at those times at richarddugan.com. The 4th time, you thought I'd forget, 9 a.m. on Wednesdays, 9 a.m. following the news on Wednesdays on this fine station as we continue to bring you guests I think that you really do enjoy, and it bears out because we're fast approaching 35,000 listens on SoundCloud and other podcast outlets where we are linked to, and we thank you for listening as well as reposting. SoundCloud, iTunes, TuneIn Radio, Spotify, Stitcher, Player FM, Blueberry, and other locations that we are listened through those particular portals, if you will. We are also on YouTube, where you can watch these interviews, and I hope that you will take the time to do just that. Watch these interviews and enjoy. You can see me in the foreground there. You can see all kinds of wonderful little things in the background. Like in this case, this is a shrine back in Ireland if you're watching YouTube. If you're not, you might want to. So you can see that shrine. It's a beautiful shrine there in County Galway. Connemara is the general location, I believe, is where this particular picture was taken. We also encourage you to participate in the decade of perfect vision, the 2020s. Go within, utilize your intuition, and stop and find that quiet, still, calm, peaceful place where you can re-energize, rejuvenate, and reconnect with self, as well as, some would say, even with the divine. We hope that you will do just that. And if these programs resonate with you and you'd like to become a part of the work that we are doing, we would greatly appreciate any financial support you can give us. That's why we have a PayPal and Patreon account for your security as well as ours. Our program today is going to be focusing on some lessons in love from a nonverbal boy, and having to do with a father and a family's dealing with an incredible situation that I can relate to only in one area. But before I share that, let's bring on our guest. His name is Dr. Stephen Gardner, author of Jabberwocky, Lessons of Love from a Boy Who Never Spoke. And Doctor, thank you so much for joining us. It's a great pleasure to have you with us.
Richard, it's my pleasure to be on. Thank you.
You have an extraordinary story of your son who basically, and this is where you and I kind of can relate, had cerebral palsy. My first wife had a cerebral palsy, and yet she was still able to get around and so forth. She was totally blind. In your case, your son also could not speak. Share with me. I know that cerebral palsy is more of a genetic condition, but what was the cause of his inability to speak? Was it also the cerebral palsy?
Yeah. Well, Richard, I would say CP, or cerebral palsy, is a wastebasket term. So
okay.
There's not really one cause.
Okay.
So historically, people thought that it was likely to be from birth trauma, but it's turning out that that's very rarely the case. It's more often some sort of insult that happened to the mother during pregnancy, a toxin or a virus or some unknown insult that affected the development of the brain during pregnancy. So sort of a wastebasket term. And it has a wide spectrum, as you sort of alluded to, in severity. So some people have very mild forms of CP where they might just have a slight limp, for example. And others, like my son Graham, have a much more severe situation where he couldn't speak, couldn't stand up, required help with everything. And so we had to adjust to that reality little by little after he was born, and we began to realize how severe his CP was going to be.
Mm. Now, your son, he lived into his, late teens, early 20s?
He lived to be almost 23, Richard. He died just shy of 23.
And this was, again, due to the complications therein.
So epilepsy is a frequent companion to cerebral palsy.
Mm-hmm.
And unfortunately, if people have seizures, once in a while they have a particularly bad seizure that sort of short circuits the wiring of the heart and causes a cardiac arrest. And that's what happened in our case.
Wow.
Yeah.
And how long ago was his, I like to refer to it more as a transition, but how long ago did he leave the body?
He left about 10 years ago.
Okay.
Left his body about 10 years ago. I like the way you said that because I feel his presence right now as I'm speaking to you. I think I wouldn't be speaking to you right now if it weren't for his presence in me and his, the goodness and the kindness and the love that was part of his makeup, which led to this book, which led to this conversation.
Yeah.
So I like to think he's still around in some other form.
It's amazing to think of the what I call coincidences that take place in our lives that bring us to certain points in our lives. As you went through what you went through with your son Graham, what I went through with my first wife, and the different things that we experienced over the 15 years that we were together. She is still alive today. As far as I know, not experiencing seizures per se. She has other issues that she is dealing with now, but nonetheless, and yet I never really thought too much about it. I mean, obviously when I would watch her walk on her own without any support, any crutches, canes, etc., you could tell, yeah, she's got some kind of, now this is the way I phrase it. Okay. For myself, as a legally blind individual until I was 36, I referred to my blindness as a perceived limitation.
Okay.
It was only a limitation if I allowed it. Now, some would say, well, yeah, but you can't get into a car and drive if you can't see. You can't go into an airplane and pilot, because one of my dreams was to be a pilot. Well, that may be true, but what's the point of getting into a car? It's to go from point A to point B. So there's a bus. I can walk. I love walking. Bicycling. I used to bicycle everywhere in Phoenix, where I'm from. I would get rides from people. Yep. And now, after my lens implant in 96, I have made the commitment that if somebody needs a ride, guess what? I'm going to give them a ride because I know what that's like.
Good for you.
With your son, Graham, during that period of nearly 23 years, certainly you could see the manifestation of the cerebral palsy. Again, I understand the garbage can term or garbage term, but with his condition, I would venture that you saw him first and foremost as your son, not your son with cerebral palsy.
Precisely. That's well said. And if I may, let me just offer this observation by a social worker regarding the length of his life, which was, as I mentioned, just shy of 23 years. She said to me, it's not how long Graham was here. It's the love he spread while he was here. So that's the concept that we are embracing and will want to continue to embrace for the rest of our lives. And truly believe what she said, every bit of it.
My first wife and I decided one day that we were going to have for each of us a day of silence. Now, we couldn't both do it on the same day because how would I communicate with her? Vice versa, how is she going to communicate with me? Well, I learned sign language, which she knew. So I was able to communicate with her on my day of silence and vice versa. But we didn't do it on the same day. And yet she was verbal on other days. How did Graham, who couldn't speak or didn't speak, and that's an interesting distinction I'd like for you to share with us, how did he communicate with you?
So just for your listeners and viewers, the difference between vocalize and verbalize. So vocalize means the capability of making sound.
Mm-hmm.
Verbalize means the ability to put those sounds into words that others understand. So Graham could vocalize,
Mm-hmm.
but not verbalize. But I think to get to your question, I would resort to the philosopher Winnie the Pooh.
Beautiful.
And he was having a conversation one day with Piglet, you might remember.
Yes, indeed.
Piglet said something like, Pooh, how do I spell love? To which Pooh replied, you don't spell love, you feel it. So to your point, we felt a lot of emotion and a lot of other stuff coming from inside our boy through his beautiful hazel eyes, through his expressions, through his touches. We were constantly hugging the poor guy, half to death. So we communicated really quite eloquently in nonverbal ways. There was some vocalization back and forth, and we believe that he understood everything we said. So we believe that he was cognitively all there, mm-hmm. and just not really able to respond to us verbally.
Was he in any way, shape, or form able to communicate in a written form?
No, we tried a bunch of tools, assisted technology, and nothing really stuck. He had trouble controlling his hands, so it was hard for him to focus on a keyboard, let's say. So we went through a whole litany of things to try to help him that way, and nothing really worked with him.
I don't know if you're familiar with this television program whose title I am racking my brain to try to remember, but it's of a family who has a young man who has cerebral palsy, and he's in a wheelchair. And they have this board in front of him with all kinds of words, and he wears this headset that has a red light on it that he can point to the words and tell people what he's trying to say. Was that something that was tried at all? Is that what you're referring to as some of these boards?
Yeah, assisted technology, I think, is the global term for those tools, mm-hmm. Which maybe leads us into this summer camp called Camp Jabberwocky, because we do have lots of those tools down at Jabberwocky that some of the campers are able to take advantage of. So I'm happy to introduce the camp now if you want to, or you can lead the way on that.
Well, let's do this. Let's tell our listeners. We're talking with our guest, Dr. Steve Graham, about his son, Steve Gardner, about his son, Graham Gardner. And the book is entitled Jabberwocky, Lessons of Love from a Boy Who Never Spoke. And we're going to find out what Jabberwocky is all about. But I have to comment on something on the back cover of your book that I find absolutely fascinating and always a thrill whenever I read something, especially from a rabbi, who says, this is a holy book. Now, I'm curious. This is a Rabbi Lawrence Kushner. Have you had other correspondence or connections with him? And how did he... I'm fascinated by his description of the book as a holy book.
I read his books, Richard, specifically one called The Invisible Lines of Connection, which explores the idea that many of us are connected in ways that are not that obvious on the surface. So when I got around to writing my book, I took the liberty of sending him some drafts and to get his take on them. And he was kind enough to review them and communicate with me. And he's continued to do that now. And he believes, and I subscribe to his belief, that there's no such thing as happenstance. There's no such thing as coincidence. There are things that happen in life that seem unusual, that seem atypical, that cause us to scratch our heads. And my sense is that when that's going on, that there's probably something else at play here. Maybe something that we can't articulate, or maybe we're not smart enough to express. But I've had a number of experiences like that, which I have shared with Rabbi Kushner. And I think the holiness of it, if I'm not misquoting him, is the notion that all of us people are in this thing together, that we all have disabilities, we all have abilities. We are all connected into one community, one human family, whether we realize it or not. Some of the connections are more ethereal, and some are obvious biological connections. Mm. But at this summer camp in Martha's Vineyard, where our son went, and where I was one of the camp doctors, this very eclectic group of people, with and without disabilities, forms a family by the end of their summer session together, in which they care very, very deeply about each other. They also tease one another mercilessly and laugh a lot. They argue sometimes, but they dance and they cry and they work together. And in the end, they form something we call the Jabberwocky family, a family in which people embrace one another's differences. They're not afraid of one another's differences. And they look at one another with open hearts and open minds. And that's what I think Rabbi Kushner is referring to in that beautiful phrase of his.
Jabberwockybook.com is the website we encourage you to go to. We will, of course, be linked to that website, Doctor, so that people can continue their evolutionary process, be inspired by the legacy that your son Graham left behind, but actually continues to share through you and your family. Was the diagnosis and condition that your son had from birth?
Yes, it was, Richard. Although it takes a little while to figure that out, because babies reach milestones at certain intervals in their early life, like at 2 months or 4 months. And there are kids that are slow to catch up, but do catch up after a while. Mm-hmm. So it's hard until a few months have passed to really start to be sure if there's going to be a disability or not. So in the beginning, we thought, okay, it's probably going to be very mild. Maybe he won't ride a bike, like you were talking about. But after 6 months to a year, we realized it was going to be much more involved.
How did you feel as a father when all of this started to come down early on in his life? It must have been devastating.
It was hard. I'm not sure I'd say it was ever devastating, but it was certainly hard, both physically and psychologically. Hard physically because we had a lot of sleep deprivation, a lot of sleepless nights. We had to lift Graham in and out of cars, in and out of wheelchairs. We had to lift wheelchairs in and out of cars. So in a sense, it was very hard, but the love that seemed to be coming from inside that boy, that seemed to create almost an aura around him, made it appear to us that it really wasn't all that hard. Mm. In fact, we used to have conversations with friends who had able-bodied kids, and we would tease our friends with able-bodied kids, and we would say something like, hey, at least we don't have to worry about him shoplifting. Right? Or at least we don't have to worry about him, drunk and disorderly.
Or falling out of a tree.
Falling out of a tree. Or coming home one night and saying, man, you guys suck as parents. So he never did any of those things. Yeah. So in a certain sense, it was easy because it boiled down to love. It boiled down to being with someone that you love. And in the end, by the way, reflecting back on what you said about your vision, we did learn that there were a lot of things we were going to be able to do that we might not have guessed we would be able to do in the beginning, like snow skiing, like windsurfing, like riding a two-man bike and kayaking, all with adapted technology to make it possible for us. So that discouragement maybe from the beginning that, oh my gosh, we're not going to be able to do all this normal stuff, slowly dissolved into the realization that we were going to be able to do a lot of that stuff and then some. Yeah.
I use this as an example because it's all I have. I have no children, at least not human children. But what I do have are animals. And one of the things that I have learned in this case, and I don't know if this is a similar lesson that you and your family learned too, is that it is not my job to get my animals to behave in a particular way. My job is to figure out why they are doing what they're doing. Especially when I say to our dog Angus, who's a 100-pound big black king shepherd, and he goes over to the door, and there's this ring that's on a chain that actually is used as a lock on the inside of the door. You put it over the doorknob, that ring, and the chain is of course attached to the door frame. Well, he goes over there because it's hanging down, and he hits it with his nose, saying, "Hey, I want your attention." Now, either he needs to go outside, or he wants a cookie, which is probably 90% of the time he wants a cookie.
Yeah.
And we'll say, "Angus, come lie down. Come lie down. Come, lie down." And he is very willful in that respect.
Yeah.
Our cats, quite similar. They are also very willful, and as cats are. That's just the way they are. But human beings, they express, usually they will have some kind of an expression as to when they want or need something. And you talk about your son, and it sounds to me an awful lot like there was some kind of telepathy going on here at some level. Is that a fair way of putting it? Because that's just kind of what I'm hearing.
I think that's a good word for it. While I was writing the book, I did a little bit of research on emotional touch. And I discovered that there are these researchers who actually study the neurology of affection and love. So, for example, a baby can tell a comforting, cuddling type of touch from a slap on the rear end. And it turns out we have specific fibers in our fingers and our nerve endings that carry these signals about emotional touch up to the brain. And there's a special part of the brain that processes them. Hospitals have figured this out because they have premature babies that are in these neonatal intensive care units that are really struggling. And they figured out that if somebody comes in, a kind-hearted person comes in and holds that baby in a loving way for a period of hours, those kids do better. They improve faster. So with Graham, my son, I think it was very rare that he and his mom or he and I were out of touch physically with one another. We were, constantly massaging his neck, rubbing our fingers through his hair, patting him on the back. So I think there's a lot of communication of that sort, which probably has some scientific basis if you really want to go, dig down deep.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, I know that my former late mother-in-law worked as a nurse for, I don't know, maybe 40 years, 50 years before she retired in the neonatal ICU. And it was one of the most challenging. She found it challenging in a very positive way. But for a lot of folks, it's probably one of the most challenging experiences one can have, because there are times when that's all you can do. You also know deep down inside that this little one isn't going to go much further beyond where they are right now. And so you have to accept that's what's going to happen.
Richard, that's where I embrace that comment from the social worker about time. I've been with a colleague and a friend who lost her twin babies. They were essentially stillborn. So she had them literally for a minute or two. She was allowed to hold them for a minute or two, and then they were gone. So contrasting that with almost 23 years with Graham, which felt like we were ripped off, felt like we were shortchanged.
Yeah.
But when you contrast it, maybe you look at it a little differently. You think, okay, 23 years might have been a pretty good run with a boy that full of love and gentleness and kindness and fun. So that's how we choose to look at it.
And if you went back 50, 100, 150 years, he may have been lucky enough to make it to 3.
Yeah.
Because I can't believe that these kinds of conditions didn't exist back then. I talk with a lot of people about healing, health and healing. And, what we call this condition today, they called it something totally different, but it was still the same condition, just a different name.
Yeah.
Which I thought was rather interesting. We're talking with Dr. Stephen Gardner about his son, written about in his book, that is Dr. Stephen Gardner's book, Jabberwocky, about his son, Graham Gardner. And it is Lessons of Love from a Boy Who Never Spoke. And it is an extraordinary story that we're talking here with the doctor about today. What particular specialty are you in, doctor?
So, Richard, I'm in primary care internal medicine.
Okay.
Over the years, I've been a doc at this summer camp. This will be my 25th summer. So I have sort of an unofficial specialty in assisting people with disabilities. But otherwise, primary care internal medicine is basically general medicine.
I participated in the Special Olympics. I think I was 21 years of age. Now, I brought home a lot of gold medals because I could see well enough, and I even felt guilty for participating because I could see well enough and so forth. But I still competed, and it was great fun. What kinds of activities did Graham participate in? And again, I understand that there was a great deal of support needed in order for him to do this. I'm sure that, I'm not sure. Tell me, what kinds of outdoor, especially outdoor activities, did he like to participate in?
Let's see. So I think the first thing we figured out was we could get a big oversized jogger, like a baby jogger with a canvas bottom, and take him out on long walks and long runs. And we realized how much he enjoyed the outdoors. Mm. So after that, we noticed there were some pioneers in our community, like Rick Hoyt and Dick Hoyt, the father and son that were in the Boston Marathon year in and year out. The dad would push his son, Rick.
Yes.
And they completed 32 of those darn things, an astonishing achievement. So we started scratching our heads and thinking, well, maybe we could do other stuff. So we got a 2-man bike and we participated. I would pedal in the back and Graham was more or less in a wheelchair in the front. But to paraphrase Dick Hoyt, I felt as if Graham was the athlete and I was just lending him some muscle power. Then we went on, and a gentleman up in New Hampshire taught us how to do snow skiing using a thing called a sit ski, where I would snowplow behind it with tethers on either side. And again, we had these really remarkable, almost epiphanic experiences with nature when we realized we could actually get out on the water, out on a mountain and do these things. Mm. Yeah, so there were not that many things we couldn't do, as it turned out.
Yeah. I have to say that when I was going to school, because of my high level of vision, but still it was in that legally blind category of 2200. And for those who don't know what that means, I can see at 20 feet what you can see with 20/20 vision at 200. Left eye was 2400. And now, after the lens implant, it's 20/80, 20/50 actually, with corrective lenses, and I'm now driving.
Great.
So I'm wondering, in terms of his participation in several, many different activities and so forth, in school, I'm sure that there was a certain level of protection that he had. But did he ever experience or was ever exposed to any kind of bullying as he was growing?
That's a great question. And the answer is no. He was, goosed in a sort of silly way by some preteen boys in one classroom. But that's about the worst thing that ever happened along those lines. I wrote about his fourth grade class. He was in a mainstream setting, and his teacher came up with an idea to sort of be an icebreaker about having Graham in that classroom. She called it the designated driver. And each day she would assign a student to push Graham to all their activities, recess, assemblies, whatever they were doing that day. And it turned out that being Graham's designated driver became a coveted thing for a fourth grader, an able-bodied fourth grader to do.
Wow.
And so this wonderful teacher had this insight by creating this mechanism in which very young people would understand the excitement and the gratification of assisting another person and embracing him into their community. So it was quite fantastic, quite the opposite of bullying, actually.
Oh, that's fantastic in more ways than one. Jabberwocky is the title of the book. My guest is the author, Dr. Stephen Gardner. It is about lessons of love from a boy who never spoke. And I'm going to repeat this again for those who didn't hear it, from Rabbi Lawrence Kushner. This is a holy book. Is the final photograph on the last page of the book of your son shortly in his early 20s?
Let me take a quick look, or can you show it to me, Richard?
I certainly can. This is it right here.
Yeah, that's probably age 20 or so.
Mm-hmm. Good-looking young man.
He sure was. A beautiful guy. He could have been in one of those Ralph Lauren ads, no problem.
Absolutely.
Yeah, but you can also, I think, appreciate in that photograph, there's some sort of light in his face. And you know, the conventional wisdom would be to say the light's shining onto his face, but for me, it's almost as if the light's coming from his face.
Yeah. You have in the book, of course, credits for the photos and so forth, as well as contact information for Jabberwocky. It's actually campjabberwocky.org for those who want to find out more. We're going to talk more about that as we continue talking with our very special guest here on the program, Dr. Stephen Gardner, about his son in the book Jabberwocky, which, of course, is the name of the camp that we were discussing just a little bit ago. First of all, can you give us a little background on this camp and then how you found out about this?
Back in 1953, a determined woman named Helen Lamb was working as a speech therapist outside Boston. And many of her clients or patients were kids with cerebral palsy. And she would go to their homes, and she recognized early on that many of them languished during the beautiful New England summertime in the sort of dark parlors of their families' homes. And that ticked her off. It didn't just frustrate her, but it actually made her angry. And she resolved to find a place where she could start a sleepover summer camp for kids with disabilities in a beautiful place where they could enjoy all the summer magic of the seashore, riding horses, being silly together, being in tiny cabins, laughing a lot. So in 1953, sort of on a wing and a prayer, she got on a ferry to a place called Martha's Vineyard with 3 kids in wheelchairs, 1 young assistant, very little money, and only a minimal plan about what was going to happen when they got over there. But she had a conviction, she had a belief that her dream of a summer camp for kids with disabilities was destined to come true there. And when they arrived on the island, it turned out that the people of that community embraced her idea and continue to embrace it to this day, 68 years later. So that's how the place got started.
Is there any connection between the work that they do and, let's just say, the Make-A-Wish Foundation and other foundations and organizations, nonprofits, who are they're not about the process of curing anybody, but of trying to share with people both young and old alike, with these kinds of conditions, and I'm going to say limiting conditions, that are connected with Jabberwocky, that, okay, Jabberwocky can't really do this, but we know someone who can.
Not in a specific way, Richard, no. Only in sort of, shared philosophy. We have a relationship with the Perkins School for the Blind in Boston, for example, but it's very peripheral. Mm-hmm. There are some sister camps that have sprung up from Jabberwocky, one up in Vermont, which is equally wonderful, called Zeno Mountain Farm, that has summer and winter activities. So philosophically, I think Jabberwocky is aligned with a lot of other associations, but it remains a small, independent operation on Martha's Vineyard.
Well, I am certainly glad these different organizations and in this case, Camp Jabberwocky are around to help kids to have as much of a normal life. And then even that is a relative term, because what in the Sam Hill is normal? Doc, what? You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I do know what you're saying. And by the way, when we leave Camp Jabberwocky and go back to the real world, we all share sort of the same question in the back of our minds, which is, why can't the real world, the normal world, be more like Camp Jabberwocky? Meaning more playful, more whimsical, sillier, more provocative, but in the end, a place where people are not afraid of other people's differences, but they actually embrace them with open hearts and open minds.
Yeah.
So, so in a way, we'd rather have Jabberwocky be normal, the normal thing. Mm-hmm. And then when we go back wherever we came from, make whatever that is more like Camp Jabberwocky.
Well, I have to say I couldn't agree with you more. I will also tell you that my first wife, I'm going to share this regardless, there was a very angry part of her that felt that the world, I don't want to say owed her, but that was they were unwilling to consider her. Okay. Condition, almost to the extent, okay, let's make everybody blind, or let's turn all of the lights out in the homes and the offices and the stores, et cetera, et cetera. In other words, don't try to put me on your playing field. Why don't you try mine, kind of thing. Mm-hmm. And I can appreciate the bitterness. I had that happen when I was working for a warehouse in Phoenix that was run by the state. It was a warehouse full of light bulbs. And the warehouse was run 95% by visually impaired and blind people. Wow. And they used this they called it Walkman. Yeah. And you'd wear the headset with the microphone and you'd call out the various commands. I worked there for a while. This was before my lens implant. It's how I got my lens implant, because I had state insurance, health insurance, and so I was able to do this. But we're talking about light bulbs from the size of a grain of rice to these giant, like, lighthouse bulbs. Now, here's the interesting factor in this. Before this warehouse was open, the government used to store and ship to its respective places that they needed these light bulbs, whether it was for aircraft or whatever. And their breakage rate for delivery was up around 25 to 45%. But when the blind took over and they did the picking, what we called picking and packing, you know what our breakage rate was? Less than 1%. Yeah.
There's a lesson in that.
Yeah. But it was an extraordinary experience. But to the point, I got my lens implant on the 6th of March, 1996, and I was still working at the warehouse. Well, when some of the people there found out that I was going to get this lens implant and I was going to be able to see better than before and even better than them, there was, I could feel it, palpable resentment. And this is one of the problems that we have, and that is that people cannot be grateful and thankful for somebody's. My wife at that time, who totally blind wife, made a comment that rings in my ears even to this day. She says, I hope I get to benefit from your new sight. Mm-hmm. And I just thought that was the oddest of comments. It's like, well, we're a couple. We're married. We're in a relationship. How would you not?
Yeah.
And of course, obviously I'm not there today, obviously, but did you ever feel that in reference to your son and the sons and daughters of other families, maybe in your neighborhood? And did you ever feel that from your son in terms of his feeling maybe resentful that other people were better off than he was, and he was sort of, playing the victim?
I never got that sense from Graham. There were times, though, there were times when he seemed to be in distress, meaning he would grimace, let's say, or he would have some writhing movements we call athetosis. It would get worse. And I would try to figure out what the heck was bothering him. And I was kind of his de facto physician for most of his life, because it was a lot easier for me to take care of him than haul him off to a hospital emergency room. Mm-hmm. But in most of those cases, I never could quite figure out what it was that was bothering him. And that troubled me. It made me feel guilty. I wondered if I was missing something physical, or maybe even missing something psychological that was bothering him that he just couldn't tell me about. But he had such strength that whatever it was, he got himself through those episodes and out the other end. And then he would be smiling again, and that radiance would return to the world from him, even though I was not smart enough to figure out what was bugging him during those periods of time. Mm.
It's an extraordinary story. You're going to want to pick up a copy of the book Jabberwocky. Where does the name come from? Because it almost sounds like something from Star Wars.
Well, back in the 1800s, for some reason, people enjoyed what they called nonsense poems.
Okay.
And a leading writer of nonsense poems was Lewis Carroll, the author of Alice in Wonderland. Mm-hmm. And Jabberwocky was his most famous nonsense poem. So it sounds like something's going on in the poem, but actually nothing's going on. What's in there is a lot of interesting words, a lot of interesting images, which Mrs. Lamb, the camp founder, was very fond of. So when she founded the camp on Martha's Vineyard, she made the decision to call the camp Jabberwocky. Maybe because she just loved the poem, or maybe because she thought there was some sort of symbolism in the randomness and the lack of sense of the poem. Maybe she was trying to say that there's no rhyme or reason why some kids have these challenges and some kids don't. I'm not really sure. I never asked her that question. But so it went from being a nonsense poem in the 1800s to being one of the first sleepover camps for people with serious disabilities in the U.S. in 1953. And in my stealing that word for the title of my book, I'm using it almost more as a philosophy. Jabberwocky as a way of looking at other people a little differently, looking at ourselves a little bit differently, not being afraid, to quarrel or to have arguments, but in the end, to make the decision to have each other's backs, to embrace each other's differences, and to form a community together, a family together. Mm. So for me, the term is really, it's obviously the place that I love on Martha's Vineyard, but it's also a philosophy of life.
Do you still go to Camp Jabberwocky? Do you still support and work with the people there as well as the kids, the campers, as it were?
Richard, when Graham passed away 10 years ago, his mom and I had to make a tough decision. We knew that if we went back as volunteers, it would be painful to be there without him in this magical place we'd shared so many great memories with him. But we also knew that if we went back, we would be nurtured and warmed by the people of Jabberwocky, and there would be no other place on earth that would give us more reassurance and Jabberwocky love than doing that. So we went back. So I've continued now. This will be my 25th summer, minus last year for the pandemic where we had to cancel it for the very first time. So I had 13 years with Graham, and now I've had about 11 going on 12 with him not there physically.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Talk to us a little bit about your faith. I would have to believe that at one point in this journey, you had to feel quite tested, kind of a little bit like Job, maybe.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. But again, I think that the day-to-day love for Graham and from Graham just offset that. And, at some point we realized, I guess, that he was influencing us, his mom and dad, in a certain way, but also other people around him were sort of astonished by this light, this ethereal quality coming from inside him. So it was hard to feel resentful, even when we got very tired. That might sound a little Pollyanna-ish, but I don't remember ever feeling resentful. Certainly, I must have been angry at times, and maybe I've glossed over that a little bit in my memory.
What about your relationship? That, as we talked at the front end of the program, we encourage people to spend time during the decade of perfect vision, the 2020s, going within. What about your relationship with your God? Your inner voice, your intuition, et cetera, et cetera. How has that changed and developed or evolved, if you will?
So there's another Rabbi Kushner. We talked about Lawrence Kushner earlier. Rabbi Harold Kushner wrote a book called When Bad Things Happen to Good People.
Mm-hmm.
And in that book, he wonders if God can be both good and omnipotent. Because if God were omnipotent, that would mean that God wanted these bad things to happen, like the Holocaust, for example. I think that Rabbi Kushner, Harold Kushner, concluded that God does not want bad things to happen to people, especially children, but that God can be present in the love that comes from and surrounds those people when adversity occurs. So that's the take on it that I've chosen to embrace. One of my own patients wrote me a note when Graham passed away. He was a theology student, and we'd had this discussion about whether God can be good and omnipotent. So I hit him with a question, and he wrote me a note, and he said, when Graham passed away, God was the first one to cry. So that resounded with me and still does. Bad things happen to good people all the time. And the best way we can respond to the randomness of it is with love. It sounds simple. The Beatles talked about that 40 years ago. We've been learning that lesson over and over again for a long time. But I think it's that simple. At the end of the day, it's all about love.
What about your relationship with your wife? How has that changed?
So we ended up splitting up, and Graham was fairly young, maybe 3 or 4 years old. But we agreed to share the responsibilities for caring for him, and we agreed to remain his advocates, his primary advocates for the rest of his life. And we are to this day. even though we no longer live under the same roof.
Mm-hmm. Was there any part of Graham that had any kind of an influence in that split, even if it was ancillary?
I think, curiously, Graham probably kept the marriage together longer than it would have otherwise been, rather than contributed to breaking it up. That's my take on it. You'd have to ask Graham's mom her take on it. She might have a different take. But I think we wanted to hang in together and do our best to give this boy the best possible quality of life for as long as we could. In the end, we ended up accomplishing that, but separately.
And today, what is your relationship like? Obviously, you're separated. You're not living in the same place anymore.
It's a great relationship today. In fact, she's a big fan of the book. I think she's a star in the book and many of the stories, so that she recognizes that. But I think the book is a celebration primarily of Graham, but also of his mom, the power of an incredibly loving, strong mom. And the same thing could be said for the power of having a loving dad, too. Yeah.
Do you find that a lot of couples who have children, let's say going through Jabberwocky, they end up having to face and sometimes even go through what you and your former wife had to go through and went through?
I'm not sure if it's different from the general population, Richard, as far as, say, divorce rates. It's certainly challenging, obviously, to have a profoundly disabled child. You can't sugarcoat that.
Yeah.
And so my guess is it probably does accelerate the demise of some marriages. Yeah. But I can't cite statistics that would support that.
Right. Well, to me, it's extraordinary that you two worked together for a period of time during his life, and even after his transitioning out of the body, and yet he continues his legacy through the two of you and through the folks at Camp Jabberwocky, as well as through the book Jabberwocky. And I think that's an extraordinary thing for someone to have accomplished who never spoke a word, but was still able to communicate in ways that you were able to pick up on. I think that's rather extraordinary, because you and I both know the stereotypical male doesn't cry, doesn't show emotion, and the last, I even think of, I even think of the character Murray on the Goldbergs television program. He was always referring to his kids as morons, and yet every once in a while he has these incredible insights, and it's like his aha moment. Oh, I need to be a little bit more, I need to soften up a little bit here, and I find that's a challenge for a lot of us guys.
So, I mentioned in my book, Washington Irving stated that there is a sacredness in tears. They are the messengers of grief, and they are the messengers of unspeakable love. I think I'm quoting him correctly there. So I don't mind crying, admitting that I cry a lot, and it feels good.
Yeah.
And again, there's probably a hormonal basis for that too. Like we talked about the emotional touch.
Yeah.
When we release tears, we're probably letting our cortisol level go down, our stress level, and maybe our endorphins go up or something like that. But yeah, I think crying is, with the crying I do now about Grant is crying out of joy. Or let's say it's 90% out of joy and 10% out of grief. Early on, it was probably the other way around.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I have to say that as a kid growing up, and maybe this has to do, as you say, hormonally, with the fact that I had 4 sisters along with a mother, and I had one brother and a father, and we'd watch Little House on the Prairie and other types of movies, or television shows, and I got choked up, and I would have the tears. Wouldn't necessarily cry out loud. I kind of keep it to myself over in the corner kind of thing, Yeah, I would get weepy when watching those kinds of programs because it was so touching.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, we feel that way all the time at Camp Jabberwocky.
Yeah.
I feel like I'm about to cry 24 hours a day because of what I'm witnessing there.
Yeah. What about your upbringing and your parents and siblings and so forth? Tell me a little bit about how that has played into the work that you have done during the nearly 23 years with Graham, but also even before that. I mean, it seems to me that what you shared with him while he was in body was a part of you already. And I'm curious as to whether that was something that maybe your family or parents maybe instilled in you at some level.
If it was either parent, Richard, it was my mom. She was a serene, graceful, kind, spirited woman. And I think probably without any formal teachings, it was more osmosis, being around this lovely, lovely human being made me want to, be like her when I grew up. And I wanted to be proud, to be a compassionate soul. I still wanted to be a ball player when I grew up. I had the, normal childhood idols and stuff. But I think probably, to your point, if it came from anybody in my immediate family, it was from my mom. She was a soulful, gracious, kind, lovely human being.
Mm. And aside from Graham, any other children?
No, he was it. So the Jabberwocky campers are sort of surrogates in a way, I guess. Many of them, they feel very much like family. And we try to keep it going when we're away from camp. We only get to go to camp for up to a month during the summer, and it's a bit challenging, to try to keep people together during the other 11 months. But we make an effort to do it in different ways. Yeah.
Well, I know that we've learned through this past year, 2020, we've learned of ways of doing that. Obviously, as you and I are conversing here on Zoom.
Yeah.
And so it's certainly taught us a lot about how to stay connected, at least in the best way that we possibly can under certain circumstances.
Yeah.
So I would think that maybe this summer might be a good summer that maybe folks will get together again.
Yeah.
In the physical at the camp and so forth there on Martha's Vineyard. Am I correct that there are no? Is it Martha's Vineyard that has no cars?
It has cars, but no traffic lights.
Okay.
But the rate limiting variable, Richard, is the number of ferries that go over there. So
yeah.
Hope if they don't let more ferries go, then the traffic won't get any worse than it is.
Well, that's what they say. If you find a wonderful little small town somewhere where you want to live because it's so small and quaint and everybody knows your business and you know everybody else's business, eventually a bunch of people are going to move there and it's not going to be a small town anymore. And that's the downside. I used to think about that in terms of finding that one place on the planet that was it was just all mine. But if I could find it, then so could everybody else.
That community has embraced Camp Jabberwocky. And as you probably know, Martha's Vineyard is one of those summer enclaves. Mm-hmm. There's some very entitled people end up going with very deep pockets. But having said that, the island has continuously embraced Jabberwocky over the years, and without the support and the love of the people of that island, Jabberwocky wouldn't exist.
Yeah.
So it's contributed its own unique piece to the fabric of this beautiful island. And I think most of the islanders realize that the island's a hell of a lot more interesting now with Jabberwocky part of it than it would be otherwise.
Yeah.
just with with an unlimited number of yacht clubs and golf clubs and stuff.
And I think the same thing can be said about your community and you. Without you, your community wouldn't be what it is today either. And the contribution that you are making, especially through your book, Jabberwocky: Lessons of Love from a Boy Who Never Spoke. Is this your first endeavor as far as book writing?
It is, Richard. I've written some short pieces. In fact, if your listeners want to go to Jabberwockybook.com, they would be able to read a short piece I wrote about the 3 months I spent in Haiti after the earthquake. But so I've written some short pieces like that, sort of philosophical pieces about some humanitarian experiences that I've had. But this is the first crack at a real book.
Well, I think that it would behoove everyone to go to your website. Again, it's Jabberwockybook.com. Okay, I'll spell it JABBERWOCKYBOOK.com. And you can find out more about Dr. Steve Gardner, as well as his son Graham, and the work that they and the family have done to help others as well. And we are very grateful for the opportunity to have brought this story and you to our listeners here on Tell Me Your Story.
Yeah, Richard, thank you for having me on for such a long time.
You bet. I thank you so much. Oh, again, my guest is Dr. Steve Gardner. And Steve, I have one more set of 3 questions I'd like to ask you that I ask all of my guests at the end of the program. You may have addressed them during the program, but I like to ask them directly. Before I do that, I want to let you know, folks, that this program is here 4 times a week on this fine station, 7 a.m. and 7 p.m. on Sunday and 1 a.m. Monday morning, and then 9 a.m. Wednesday for the special edition of Tell Me Your Story. We also podcast on SoundCloud, iTunes, TuneIn Radio, Spotify, Stitcher, Player FM, Blueberry, and other locations that you folks are reposting to, and thank you for doing that. We're on YouTube. Tell Me Your Story is the channel, so we hope that you will go there. And then we also want you to participate in the Decade of Perfect Vision by going within, spending a little time. You can call it what you want, prayer, meditation, just quiet time, and just relax, listen to that still small voice, and know that you're taken care of. The universe is there to help us, and certainly through the work that our guest and his family have done for not only for Graham, but for others through the writing of the book. I hope that you will go to Jabberwockybook.com. We also hope that you will support this program financially, and whatever you can contribute, we would be grateful for. You can go to our homepage where there's a link to both PayPal and Patreon accounts. That's for your security as well as ours. And we thank you so much for anything that those who have contributed and for those who will contribute. So we get to the part of the program that I actually kind of enjoy, because you never know what kind of answers you're going to get. And whatever answers come, please just go ahead and share them. First of 3 questions is, who is Steve Gardner?
Steve Gardner is a caregiver who has had the blessing of learning about kindness and love from a plethora of gracious and compassionate souls, some of whom are very, very young, teenagers.
What is it that you hope to or want to achieve through the work that you're doing now?
The Jabberwocky family is about belonging, about the feeling that we all have, I think, that we want to belong to something greater than ourselves. And in that place, we all belong together. We experience the opposite of loneliness. And I would love it if we could export that feeling off the island when we leave at the end of the summer, and to a greater extent bring that ethos into what seems to be quite a troubled world at large all around that island.
And finally, what is your life's purpose?
Well, I mean, it's quite possible that leaving this book behind is going to be one of my life's legacies. And I think in terms of purpose, it's just to treat other people to the extent that I'm capable with an open heart and an open mind throughout the days of my life, and to try to embrace as many of them as possible.
Well, Doctor, I thank you again, Dr. Steve Gardner, for this time today, as well as for the book, Jabberwocky. Go to jabberwockybook.com. Again, we will be linked to your website, and we really do appreciate the insights you've given us into yourself and your son, your family, and the work that you're doing through the Camp Jabberwocky as well. I'm Richard Dugan, and I thank you for listening to Tell Me Your Story, New Paradigms for a New World. We are giving you choices and knowledge of those choices to help make your dreams come true. And until our next broadcast, podcast, videocast, love to love.